Well, good evening, councillors, member of the public, officers. Welcome to this Corporate Scrutiny Committee, the second of our four-year term of Corporate Scrutiny. And the Corporate Scrutiny's main role in life is understanding and analysing the financial position of Northamptonshire. So, I also must say that we are recording, we are live on YouTube, so from that point of view, be aware that the community is looking in, and I would just say to the community, whoever is looking in, if you ever have questions or thoughts about what we do in these rooms, what we do as the council, you'll be able to pick me up and others on the website, send an email in, ask the question, if that's appropriate. Can I request that mobile phones are switched off? I know that it's possible for councillors to tweet or put on Facebook during the meeting as long as it doesn't affect the nature of the meeting. But please make sure they're on silent or switched off. If you would like to speak, I will introduce you by name and invite you to address the meeting at the appropriate time. And one of my great things is, again, as we're being watched by others, is I would just like very quickly to go around the room and everybody to introduce themselves. And as you put the microphone on, just a reminder, microphone on, the cameras will go towards you, microphone off, they'll go to the next person. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to Raj and round the table.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Raj Sohal. I'm a Scrutiny Officer here at Northamptonshire Council, and I support the Corporate Scrutiny Committee and the Health Scrutiny Committee.
Good evening. I'm Councillor Scott Brown, Councillor for the Earls Barton Ward.
Good evening. I'm Councillor Bill McElhinney, Councillor for the Desborough Ward.
Good evening. I'm Councillor Dennis McLean, Pipers Hill Ward. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Councillor Jonathan Carvetta and I'm from the Brickhill and Queensway Ward in Wellingborough.
Good evening, I'm a member of the public. My name is Lynn Buckingham.
Good evening, Tom Barden, Head of Performance, Intelligence and Partnerships.
Good evening, Dean Mitchell, Assistant Director of Finance and Accountancy.
Good evening, Claire Edwards, Executive Director of Finance and Performance.
Good evening, Guy Holloway, Assistant Chief Executive.
Hello everyone, George Candler, Executive Director for Place and Economy.
Hi everybody, I am Camilla Coulson Patel, the Director of Law and Governance and the Monitoring Officer at Northamptonshire Council.
Hello, I'm David Watts. I'm the Executive Director for Adults, Health Partnerships and Housing.
Hi, I'm Jane Bethay. I'm Director of Public Health, Communities and Leisure.
Hello, I'm Steve Geary, Councillor St Peter Ward, Kettering.
Evening, Councillor Darren Rance, Brickhill and Queensway.
I'm Councillor Gavin Beals. I'm stepping in for Councillor Chris Kellett on the Queensway and Brickhill.
Thank you, colleagues, and I'm Councillor Jim Hakewill, Chairman of Corporate Scrutiny, and thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. As we move through the agenda, we have received one request to speak to the committee tonight, and that's from Lynn Buckingham, and that's on agenda item 4, Finance Activity Report. Thank you for coming along tonight, and I shall call you in at the appropriate time as we start that item. Apologies for absence. Raj.
We've received apologies for absence from Councillor Paul Brooke and Councillor Ben Jameson, and Councillor Steve Geary is attending as a substitute.
Thank you. And we also welcome, as Gavin said, Gavin Beals, who I think is going to move on to this committee, so welcome to you tonight. Declarations of interest. We all have potential interests which the wider community might think was declarable. So I would just like to ask around the room, does anyone have any declarations of interest about any matter that we are talking about tonight that is on their declaration? Any declarations of interest for this evening? And a stunned silence. So the answer is we're all madly interested in North Northamptonshire, but we don't have a specific interest personally in the business that we're transacting tonight. So the next item is 03 on our agenda, and that is the minutes of the last meeting. And I'm just going to try and pick those up on my computer. So as we go through the minutes of the last meeting, that is on page 5. I'll just mention the page numbers, and if anyone's got anything to say as a matter of accuracy, not what we decided or didn't decide, if you would just show or catch my attention. So that's page 5, page 6, page 7, and on page 7 I noticed a typo there. We resolved that the Health Scrutiny Committee. Clearly it was the Corporate Scrutiny Board, so that's just a typo to be amended in the minutes on page 7. Thank you for doing that, Raj. Page 8, page 9. So, can we agree that those minutes... Do we need a mover and seconder? We do. Who would like to move the excitement of the last minutes? Councillor Scott Brown and Councillor Dennis McLean as a seconder. So those minutes are duly approved tonight. Thank you. So we go to item number 4.
Chair, I think we need a vote for show of hands.
Do we need to vote on that? Or? Okay, we do. So a vote of the councillors on agreeing those minutes. All agreed. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. That's teamwork working in action, isn't it? Thank you for that. So we come to agenda item number 4, where Lynn Buckingham has kindly come along to talk to us. So Lynn, you have the traditional, I'm sure you know this anyway, the 3 minutes for your comments, and to thank you for coming along.
Thank you, and good evening, Chair, councillors and officers, and the opportunity to speak on this item. Appendix B shows a £122 million capital programme, but only 93 million will actually be spent. That's a quarter of the programme, 29 million slipping into future years. This looks neat on paper, but isn't efficiency. It's reprofiling, deterring today's problems in tomorrow's budgets. Let me give you 3 sharp examples. Housing revenue account, £10 million won't be delivered this year. That means slower repairs, delayed upgrade, and fewer new homes. In the meantime, tenants are left in poor conditions, and homeless costs keep rising, but in the revenue budget. Schools and children's services, £9 million of, send and mainstream expansions have slipped. That leaves children in temporary classrooms or expensive out-of-county placements, driving up costs today. Place and economy, nearly £15 million delayed, even food waste rollout. Every delay pushes up future borrowing and leaves services under pressure now. Appendix C shows the trick in the accounting. When you spend slips, the borrowing and grant use slippages too. That looks good short term because we avoid interest payments this year, but the debt bombshell is just pushed down the road. And Appendix D reveals the real sting. The revenue budget is already under severe pressure. These capital delays mean that the council saves nothing in practice. The costs of homelessness, temporary classrooms and fleet maintenance just pile into revenue instead. How is the council to carry on balancing its book by shunting capital spend into the future while the day-to-day pressure worsens? Reprofiling is not a strategy. It's a symptom of weak delivery, and it stores up bigger risk for the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. You're well aware of all of those items over the years, and not just this year, but over many years from that point of view. Thank you very much for coming along and highlighting those issues. Certainly we as a committee have background meetings where we discuss these things, and highlighting them is never a bad thing. So thank you very much for that, and I hope also that you'll take time to come during our budget process later in the year. You're going to leave us at this point. Yep. Have a good evening, what's left of it. Thank you. So with those comments from Lynn Buckingham in our mind, I now move over to, I think it is Claire, to bring item number 4 to introduce that and present it to us. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Chair. So the report before you is our Q1 forecast, and it is now an amalgamation of our revenue outturn, treasury position and capital outturn as well. So as we said in our previous meeting, we are trying to streamline the finance reports that we provide to you, and to make sure that the information is much more understandable and accessible for you as members as well as residents. The report does go to outline that the General Fund is forecasting to overspend by 9.4 million, the HRA to underspend by 523,000, the Dedicated Schools Grant is forecasting to have a deficit of 19 million, in year of 18 million and so on. Also, what we're also looking at in here is treasury activity. So we have significant cash balances that we manage during the year, which we're getting significant return on, versus the portfolio that we have for external debt. So you'll see that there's a big difference between the interest rate that we're gaining on our investments of just over 6% and what we pay out in debt of about just over 3%. So see there's quite lots of activities in there. Hopefully that the first 25 pages that is in the report shown in Appendix A of the main body of the report that went to executive gives you that information quite easily and succinctly. So you understand what our key risks are, our key challenges, what we've achieved, and hopefully we'll start to develop how we're looking to mitigate those. So there is some key headlines, as we've just heard, around the capital programme. So yes, we are looking to reprofile the capital programme. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are not delivering the capital programme or delivering the items that are in there. We have constantly been trying to work to and strive to ensure that we have the right capital in the right places at the right time. And there are instances where some of those projects, for whatever reason, are not delivered, or it's been decided that they need to move and we've got them in the wrong financial year. So there are opportunities, and there always will be opportunities to enable that to happen and to be facilitated. Also, one of the things I would point out is that whilst we are looking to move some money around the capital programme for the HRA in particular, it doesn't mean to say that we're not delivering our repairs. So there is activity in buying houses. We don't have anything on the agenda to build houses, and we will be looking to obviously explore that through the medium-term financial plan. It doesn't, we're not seeing an increase in homelessness costs. Actually, we're making savings in that space by some really creative activity that we're seeing through that team. So whilst we do see that there is a big link between some of the capital investment that we're making and some of the revenue savings that we'll potentially look to make, the capital programme is really starting to sort of show that. There's some significant investments going into children's schools and continuing to do that. And there was also some significant investment across the board in relation to children's homes. So once you do look at the capital programme beyond this financial year as well, that we do have in the medium term, there is some significant investments that we plan to be doing. So I'll pause there and happy to take any questions. We're not only noting the report and the information that's in it, but we're also seeking some suggestions and areas that you'd like to focus on as scrutiny in the forward plan and sort of months to come in terms of what you might look to investigate and do a deep dive on. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for that overview. As councillors, same as yourselves, we've done our best to look at 176 pages of information, and to draw out and focus on different issues. Certainly the work that we've been doing in the last meeting and in this meeting to try and focus down, and I see that equally in the last item we've got today in terms of what we're going to scrutinise. Certainly a lot of information there, and from my point of view, when you get to page 27, and this is in response to our request, with the dashboard, or should I say probably page 25, the revenue summary dashboard is extremely useful, and maybe colleagues will have a view on that to make it easier for us to focus on what we're going to scrutinise. So thank you for the work on consolidating some of that and helping us to do our best for the executive during scrutiny. So with those points, colleagues, have you any questions that you want to bring forward in relation to Claire's presentation? Councillor Jonathan Carvetta.
Thank you, Chair. So what are the primary drivers behind the forecast 9.421 million general fund overspent, and how early were these pressures identified?
Through you, Chair. So as it says in the report, there is a couple of elements that make up the 9.4 million. So it won't be a surprise to you to hear that it's in the areas that we do experience quite significant challenges around demand. So that will be in our social care activities. So that's right across the board in terms of adults and children's. And we do see some significant increases around placement costs. So for children's, it was notified to us in April. And the same for adult social care. So we work with the teams quite closely on a monthly basis, although we only report quarterly, but we do obviously have those connections and work with the teams within each area to obviously look at how we can mitigate that and how we can work towards some of the areas that we're seeing spiking, understanding what those reasons are and how we can try to sort of address some of those issues. Not always be able to do that. Sometimes we have some complex cases that come in that we would not be able to budget or forecast for, so those are things that obviously we try to work with those service areas to deal with as best we can. But as you'll appreciate, there are many items that go into that, and a lot of it will be around some of those additional costs that we do see coming through the demand areas.
Thank you, Claire. Colleagues, if there's any follow-up question or any other questions on this item 4. Councillor Dennis McLean.
Thank you, Chair. Just reference the answer that you gave there. Is the overspend due to the fact that it's statutory spending and we've got no choice, or is there any way of ameliorating that at any time?
So, thank you, Chair. So, yes, most of the areas that we will see our overspends in predominantly will be statutory. So there will be no choice to deliver it, but obviously what we are looking to strive to do is to make sure that it's financially sustainable going forward. So there's always a choice, even though it's discretionary, but there will be cases and times where we have no choice to be able to place them in certain provisions that would be quite costly and work with the service areas to sort of make sure we can mitigate those going forward. So there's always a time lag in terms of understanding some of the volatility that we see through those service areas, and we're working really closely with some of the teams within both directorates in children's and in adults to really get and understand. And you'll see within that pack that we've put some of the more detailed analysis that we have with adult social care, for example, and you'll start to see some of that trend is starting to sort of show in terms of that uptick in demand and then the uptick in the cost. So you start to see that correlation in terms of what the data is telling us and therefore what we're looking to predict as that future cost. But we'll always be working to try and mitigate those costs as much as we can, but it's always in the statutory services where we see most of our significant pressures.
Thank you, Dennis. Councillor Geary, did I see you catching my attention? Councillor Steve Geary.
So this is a question with regards to the dedicated schools grant. So there's a significant deficit in the region of 18.6 million. And how do we recover that? There's options around delivering better value programs. There's the DSG safety valve. So I'd like some commentary in terms of how you're going to recover that deficit.
Thank you, Chair. So we've been working on a dedicated schools deficit and recovery plan with the Department of Education. We're not at the point of a safety valve. Our deficit is not big enough from the DfE's perspective, surprisingly. But nevertheless, we have been working quite closely with the Department of Education to work through what our options are. A lot of the issues that we're facing is going to be around the sufficiency of children, particularly for the SEN placements that we have. So what you have seen in our capital programme is twofold. One is around working with schools to have that transitional arrangements for SEN provision, so an alternative provision rather than special schools, and also working in relation to the children's provision for homes, etc. So we're sort of having a bit of a two-pronged attack in terms of that investment that we've got in our capital programme to build more places and to make sure that we can actually provide for those children in care. Future, for looking down the line, that's also one of the biggest areas that we're looking to obviously really focus on that provision and make sure that we can really sort of give that investment into the council and to the children in making sure that we do have and can affect and give a much more effective SEND provision for Northamptonshire. But it will take time. This has not just come about overnight. This has been something that's there in the longer term, and we are not the only ones who have a massive deficit. I don't think there's any council now that doesn't have a deficit in the whole of England, and hopefully some of the reforms that are coming along that we'll see landing in next year's budget will hopefully work towards helping resolve some of those issues. But it will take a long time for us to work through that deficit, and it will be linked to the sufficiency strategy for children's placements in schools.
So what's your best estimate in terms of time frame for that particular SEN bulge to be dealt with? And what percentage of the deficit is down to SEN alone?
So thank you, Chair. All our deficit is down to high needs block, which is in relation to SEND. In terms of time frame, as not being the DCS, I'd probably be remiss of me to comment on that, but we could certainly find out what those timelines would be and come back to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Claire. Just before I bring Dennis back, sorry, George.
That's okay.
George Candler, apologies.
No, that's okay. I was just going to, I suppose, link home to school transport as well to what Claire's been saying through you, Chair. So home to school transport, you'll see, has got an overspend of about 1.9 million at the moment. And again, whilst, for example, last year we saw an 8% increase in mainstream school transportation, we saw a 26% increase in special educational needs and disabilities transport provision. So the demand in that area is not only reflected in the high needs block, it's also reflected in the general fund as well, as you're seen in the papers. And again, that's something that we're working hard on with colleagues in children's services, because the more we understand sufficiency, both now and in the future over the next 5 years, we can plan that into our capital programme. And the focus going forward is to have more integration of special educational needs into mainstream school provision. And what we then need to do is understand what impact, that positive impact, that can then have on home to school transport, where we can start to optimise some of our routes. So, for example, this year, as an example, at Isbrook, previously there were 9 routes, different routes scheduled for children. Whereas now we've reduced that down to 1, possibly 2. And that's through a combination of improved ICT infrastructure, but also having greater sufficiency of places to people where that demand is, so they're not having to travel further in either a taxi or other form of public transport. So the two are linked, and I just thought it would be helpful, Chair, just to bring home to school transport in, because obviously it's a significant overspend as well, and I wouldn't want members not to think that that's not recognised by officers, in particular myself, where I've got that responsibility and looking to make further improvements on that. Thank you.
Councillor Dennis McLean. Thank you, George. Dennis McLean.
Thank you, Chair. George, reference to the transport that we're putting on, is it mostly taxis that we're using at the moment, and that's the reason for the high cost?
Through you, Chair, it's a combination. So we have about 73 taxi operators covering Northamptonshire. What we're looking to do more and more, though, is enable children and young people to use some of our commercial routes and to use some of the provision that we have through Stagecoach, for example, and some of our other more localised providers. But clearly, a number of those children that have got special educational needs do need specific transport as laid down in their education and healthcare plans. So, and we are statutorily obliged to provide that. But where we can optimise some of those routes, that's what we're looking to try and do. But at the moment, we're forecasting a 10% uplift in costs and a 20% uplift in demand based on previous years, just to give members a feel for the challenges that we've got in home to school transport. That doesn't mean that we're looking to suppress that and bring that down, but that's the challenge that we face at the moment in that particular sector. Thanks.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, George. Steve, I think, did you have some questions on? I'm just going through from a previous conversation. Oh no, is it Dennis who? I'm just looking forward. Or am I getting there? Darren, forward-looking budget scrutiny strategy. Some questions on that one.
How will the Q1 position influence 25-26 in year's decisions making, and what adjustments, if any, are being considered?
Through you, Chair. So just if I can understand the question, do you mean changes to the 26-27 budget or the in-year changes to 25-26?
So future changes.
Okay. So the process that we will go through for our medium-term financial plan is that we will look at all the pressures and savings within the forecast, and we will take a view on whether we believe that they are ongoing. So the trend tells us with our data that we're looking at that these activities will be ongoing, and we will build that into our medium-term financial plan. If they're one-off, i.e. it's just an occurrence this year and won't be happening again, then they will not be included. So we'll work through those assumptions as we build the medium-term financial plan into the future years to make sure that then also we have to have the significant funding and make sure that we can match fund it. And those questions then we'll be working with the service areas to how we can mitigate that if we're not able to fund that and balance our budget. So that's the sort of budget process that you'll see in the paper that's on the agenda further down in terms of that process that we go through. So what we were doing, obviously, as I said right at the beginning, this is a forecast. This is not our final number. And one thing I just want to point out as well is that there is a contingency in here which we have not used of just under £3 million. So we still have a significant way to go through the financial year. So there are still options for us to consider. We don't release that yet because we work with the service house to try and mitigate as much as we can before we then look at how we can utilise that contingency. Okay. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Claire. And I think it was Dennis, you were talking about cash flow, borrowing and investment in a previous discussion. Did you have a question on that?
Thank you, Chair. Actually, it's a question on the HRA account. I think we've asked this question already before about the causes of the 523,000 forecast underspend in the HRA. I'm sure we asked that question before.
Through you, Chair. So the forecasted underspend on the HRAs come about from a couple of areas. So what we're seeing is there's some technical adjustments which have caused some of the underspend. So we've not paid out as much as we thought we were going to pay out on borrowing and interest rates, and making sure that we have sufficient provision for that. So there is a slight adjustment technically for that, so that it's dropped through as an underspend, but rest assured we are making sure that we've got that there to reinvest back into the HRA, to make sure that we can put anything into repairs. But I'm sure I'll hand over to David to also support that.
Thank you, David Watts.
Thank you, Claire. And just to, and Chair, just to add to what Claire has said there, so we'll probably come to it later in the performance report, but you will see that the time period that it takes us to turn around voids has reduced, which means that we generate more rental income as a result of having those properties back in use much quicker than we used to be able to. I just wanted to comment on, as well, if it's okay, Chair, on the comments made by the Speaker. So whilst Claire has touched on them, there were a couple of other bits which, if I could just add to that whilst I've got the mic, if that's okay. So the one element was around capital investment as well. And again, we have significantly improved the number of stock condition surveys that have been undertaken, which enables us to build our 30-year business plan and look at the sort of borrowing that we will require to invest in that stock. It's better that we understand our stock rather than just taking a blanket approach to investing in it in that sense. Additionally, our temporary accommodation expenditure was significantly reduced last year by a combination of acquisitions and using some of our current property in the general fund differently to as a form of temporary accommodation as well. So that was significant, which is also being replicated in this year's general fund. But yes, as Claire says, some technical adjustments, but also improved rental income as a result of shorter void turnarounds.
Thank you, David. And what it really reflects is there's a lot of work going on, and as Scrutiny, we're here to try and enhance that work and to go out and help yourselves and ourselves to find new and better ways of delivering in terms of value for money. I've got Councillor Dennis McLean and then Councillor Scott Brown. Dennis.
Thank you, Chair. This is probably for you, David. I congratulate the Council on the recent build of about 8 properties, brand new properties, which were recently developed. But it said they were funded by the sale of right-to-buy council houses. How do you sort of put the two together, because we're not really getting any further forward as far as the property that we're having? So, thank you.
Through you, Chair. So I think the recent property acquisitions that you've been talking about were funded through central government grant or we're seeking approval, or we sought approval to accept the LAF3 funding, which enables us to purchase those properties. On the right to buy, so there has been some relaxations on the right to buy conditions, meaning that we can use 100% of our right to buy receipts to invest in new properties, whereas before it was at 50%. That's time limited at the moment. We don't know whether government will commit to that moving forward. However, we will also be looking, as part of the development of our corporate plan, around what are our ambitions around house building over the next 5 to 10 years as part of that development as well. That enables us to think about borrowing that might be required for any commitment which we as a local authority have to investing in housing, but it also leverages our relationships with things like social landlords over what they will invest into property developments based on what they know about demand in that sense. So we need to remember that we're not the only providers of social housing. We've got significant stockholding social landlords in the area as well.
Thank you, David. Councillor Scott Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for going back a little bit into the general fund, if I may. I'm looking at the savings tracker, which is on page 32 of our pack. I can see that 19.926 million savings have been delivered, 7.395 million to be delivered. Am I to assume that they're going to be delivered in year? And obviously the 1.322 million not delivered. Could you clarify whether that means not delivered within this year, and are they intended to be potentially delivered next year, or if they're not going to be delivered at all, and perhaps some commentary as to why they're not going to be delivered?
Through you, Chair. So the red at the moment, we have identified that they are not able to be delivered during the financial year. So they are around particular assumptions that we've made on income generation. Just to give you an example, one of them will be around reduction in interest rates, for example, where we may have estimated them to be higher for longer, or cash balances have reduced quicker than we expected. So those are based on certain assumptions at a certain point in time. And there'll be others where we thought that the service would be able to sell its services quicker than we anticipated, but the service is not set up to do that. So we've had to look at some of those assumptions when we do our forecasting, and working with those services have deemed those to be unachievable. So we put them into the red category and flagged them as not being able to be met in our medium-term financial plan. What we will do is obviously work with those service areas to understand what can be delivered, and if there is any room that we can look at other income generating activities that could do to sort of compensate for those. But as this is purely looking just at what's been proposed in the budget, there's obviously other activity that we won't include in here. So this is just tracking against those items that we put in our budget report in February this year. The green, a lot of them, just to sort of what we're going to do when we move forward on this is start to bring items in that have already been delivered. So we'll start to see a blue column come in here. So we'll start to sort of differentiate between what we think is on track to be delivered but not quite yet, and those that actually we can bank and say are actually there. So as we start to develop this, we'll start to bring more of that information in to help you understand sort of where we are on that journey. But you'll see that there is a significant part of those savings that we will be on track to deliver in terms of this financial year.
Thanks, Councillor Brown. Councillor Stephen Geary.
Whilst looking at these reports, something that's been asked several times of me is every year there's a certain amount of money that has to be spent, regardless of what we want to do in terms of flexibility and policy. And then there's a certain percentage of monies which we have some flexibility, however limited that may be. Do we have any feel typically in a year how much of our monies on day one for that 400 million, etc., is probably pretty much programmed in? We can't do too much about moving around. And then how much we can move around to deal with short-term issues?
Through you, Chair. I'll have a go at answering this. It's probably a very difficult question to say right off the bat. A significant proportion of our budget, as you'll see, that's made up from social care is not flexible. However, it doesn't mean to say that we can't be discretion around how we choose to acquire those services. So there's an element of discretion in everything that we do. In terms of the actual service delivery and what that budget is earmarked for, will still remain the same purpose. So our purpose and services will remain. We do try to build some flexibilities in, but it's minimal. I think you heard me refer just a little while ago around contingency. It's quite a small part of our budget, but it's the only wriggle room that we have. There are obviously elements in our budget that's discretionary, but they are normally around the service that we as members and we as residents would want to see maintained. So leisure facilities and those sorts of things do fall into the discretionary type of categories, but they're not necessarily something on a short term you'd want to be switching off or anything along those lines. So it's a very fine line that we have in terms of what we can be flexible on. I suppose there's a decision to be made on all of it, but a lot of it is pretty much delivering statutory services.
Thank you, Steve. David Watts.
Just to add into what Claire has said there, as the corporate leadership team, a lot of what we're doing looking over the medium-term financial plan is whether we can have a more positive risk appetite around investing in things that might reduce expenditure in some of our statutory services moving forward. So Claire earlier on talked about trying to invest in things like special needs, accommodation for, special needs education services. Within my area, we often look at things like alternative housing to support people with additional needs in, because that reduces our revenue expenditure. But what that does require is a significant commitment, usually of upfront, to enable us to get those in place. But that's all part of our budget planning, all part of our medium-term financial planning, and part of the thinking that we're doing at the moment around our next corporate plan, which we're well into stages of development.
Thank you, David. And just to come back to Claire.
Yeah, so just building on that, I think one of the things that we would ask ourselves is, whilst we do have statutory obligations, the biggest question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we do this differently? There is no silver bullet to some of the issues that we're dealing with and the funding limitations that we have as local authorities, as the public sector, not just Northamptonshire. There is that wider system issue that as local government we don't have enough funding. So how do we, as officers working with you as members in this scrutiny space, look at and consider some really different ways of how do we do things differently, while still obviously maintaining our statutory obligations to our residents, and making sure that what we have as a budget or activities that we want to propose actually still do deliver the outcomes that we want for our residents, as well as the first outcome that we want to ensure we protect. But there is that squeeze in terms of, as we further go down this route, those finances will still be the big driving question of making sure that we can deliver our statutory services but in a financially sustainable manner. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Claire. I'm minded to bring this agenda item number 4 to draw to a conclusion, and got some example recommendations to put forward. Just from myself, the first thing I think is that the sort of questions that have come around now, as we get to the end of the agenda and we talk about budget scrutiny, November, I think is quite a heavy month for us for budget scrutiny. That there's been some excellent questions around the table, and that gives all of us, but particularly our officer colleagues, the opportunity of foresight of what we're going to be asking later on in the year. And certainly no silver bullets. These aren't to extend the conversation, but just things from me as I've been listening to the debate this evening. The obvious thing, and Lynn Buckingham came forward, is the capital programme, and I'm sure it does, not to extend now, but I think we would like to hear that later in the year, that the capital programme is focused on things such as David just mentioned, that are going to, in the long term, reduce revenue, if that's putting development into schools or alternative housing and so on, even homeschool transport, things like that, that the whole capital programme should be slewed that way, and where it slips, and inevitably we understand why it does slip, that those projects which are going to save us money in the long term sort of come to the fore. And I know we'll talk about that again in the future. Just understanding the DSG, how, this is a question, government have allowed us to set the direct schools grant off of our books effectively, which is quite an astonishing thing to do. Do we lobby government, either through local MPs or directly or through the portfolio holder, to say that this is an unsustainable process? How do we actually tackle government and say, think about us, think about this particular issue? That is a question, isn't it? Sorry.
That's okay through you, Chair. Do you want to switch your speaker? Thank you, Chair. So yeah, the statutory override has been pushed back to March 2028, just to sort of bring you up to speed with that. So essentially, what does that mean? So the statutory override that we have in place for the dedicated school grants means that at the moment, that deficit that we are looking at is, as you quite rightly put, is one side of our balance sheet. It's not financed at the moment. So the danger is that once they take away that statutory override, the deficits that we have in our dedicated schools grants are fully 100% going to impact our reserves and are fully cash backed. So when we look at our reserves, we have to make sure that all our reserves can fund not just any deficit that we have in the general fund, but also fund anything that we have in the dedicated schools grant. So notwithstanding that, not only does that give Northamptonshire a significant risk, which it, as it would do any council, the issue that you've got is when you start to look at the lobbying arena, is that when you look at the wider scale problem across the whole of local authorities, it's a £6 billion ask. For them to switch off the statutory override, they would physically have to fund the cash. This is the difficulty that I think we've got, but delaying it and pushing it down the road doesn't give us the solutions that we need today to try and stem the ongoing issues that we have where, as we're seeing, the high needs block is completely underfunded in terms of what we can and can't do. So the legislation doesn't really help us in that space. We can see that they're trying to put some children's reforms coming in. When you look at what came through the budget spending review, there's quite a significant amount of funding coming into SEND, but nowhere near enough. So lobbying would be a really good way to work with someone like CCN or LGA, so CCN County Council Network, because it's generally the Tier 1 authorities as we are who have that responsibility. So I think if you want to lobby, there's quite a lot of information out there in terms of where the projections are going for SEND and what that might look like across the medium term financial plan. And it's one of the biggest risks I think local government faces if they are to withdraw that statutory purely from a financial landscape. When we start to model that, if we did nothing in our dedicated schools grant arena in terms of the actions that we're trying to take, we would have no reserves left in about 4 or 5 years' time. That's quite good compared to some authorities. They would really struggle in the next 12 months if those statutory overrides were taken away. We're not in that position, just to remind you, and obviously we're working with government and obviously with the Department of Education to work through some of the issues that we are finding ourselves in, which again are not unique to Northants.
Thank you, Claire, and apologies for asking a question when I said I wouldn't. And having done so, David, if you would like to come in.
Just in addition to the organisations which Claire has mentioned, so most of your statutory officers are part of member organisations as well. So Jane's a member of the Association of Directors of Public Health. I'm the same for Adult Social Services. Cornelia, the same for Children's Services. We all lobby as well. I'm a regional chair and meet with all regional chairs with the Director General for Social Care on a monthly basis. So we take the opportunities to talk about some of the challenges being experienced, particularly around multi-year settlements, and that giving some element of surety. I'm a bit of a geek as well, and because we're in budget setting period, over my bank holiday weekend I was watching a public accounts committee from central government from April of this year, which was on local government financial sustainability, just to prepare me for difficult conversations with Claire later on. But they did talk about SEND, they did talk about the pressures within children's services, they did talk about the DSG deficit as well. Government knows about this, but we just need to continue with the discussions that we've got and taking opportunities that we have to lobby in the right places.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Claire, for that. What I'd like to do, Raj, if we can construct, if the committee are happy with that, that as a committee we urge the leader and the cabinet members to complement the lobbying of central government on issues such as the direct schools grant. I'd like to propose that as one of the recommendations we have, if you can capture that, Raj. I think those are most of the questions I had. This is sort of a note to the side, and it comes to George. Really listening to the homeschool transport, the potential 9 routes going to 1. When we do our scrutiny later in the year, I think it would be brilliant, a sort of half-page dialogue on how that's done and how you think in the future that might work. So that's sort of not a direct recommendation from us. I'd also like to recommend that the committee is kept updated on the in-year mitigation measures being implemented to reduce the general fund overspend, including directorate-level actions and any impact on service delivery. So much again, that which we've heard tonight, to continue that process, to keep all of us engaged and involved. The dedicated schools grant, I think we've just picked that up, haven't we, Raj, in that one? And the other one that came through various comments was Treasury management. And we all in our personal lives see interest rates going up, inflation affecting what we buy, and obviously the council corporate on a much more massive scale. So I think, again, as we have these meetings in the future, and particularly in budget time, the variances between what happens as interest rates go up, inflation goes up and down, so that we might be able to go to the executive with our knowledge, as much as I know the executive will be being briefed in the same way. So recommend that future finance activity reports, a clear summary of Treasury risks, including interest rate exposure, borrowing strategy, to support transparent financial resilience monitoring. Now, colleagues, I'm sure Raj has got most of that down. Could I have someone to move that particular recommendation? Councillor Bill McHenry, and I'll take Councillor Jonathan Calvetta. So those are our recommendations from item number 4, and thank you, colleagues, and thank you, officer colleagues, for the answers. We don't necessarily have the solutions, but knowing the problem and having the answers is a long way there. So if we come now to agenda item number 5, which is the performance indicator report, and that's Claire again, is that right, Claire?
Thank you, Chair, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tom Barden to introduce the report. Thank you.
I thought he was hiding there for a minute, but no, Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Nearly got away with it. So this report covers the key performance indicators at the end of quarter 1 of this year, and it went to exec in August. It's the first report of this year and a slightly revised set of indicators compared to the report that was discussed at this committee last month, which was the Q4 report for the end of the previous financial year. It's good practice to review indicators annually to ensure that indicators are relevant to the goals and objectives of the services in that year. Sometimes that does happen in year as well, and there are a few changes highlighted at 5.4, minor changes to indicators that have been will be added in to the KPI set going forwards. The other change that is in this report compared to last time is that there is a slightly simplified scorecard. We've taken some of the columns out. We've simplified the infographics to be a much more standardised set of colours. Hopefully, members will have found that easier to read this time. The main body of the report is contained in 3 appendices. Appendix A regards the core council business. There are 44 indicators in that report. Appendix B is the extended set. There are 61 indicators in that report. That covers indicators which are reported quarterly, termly and annually. And there is 35 indicators focusing on organisational health in Appendix C. Across the whole set, there are 140 KPIs, 55% of which are on or exceeding target, 19% within tolerance, and 26% below target. So that's green, amber and red in the report. There are some highlights of performance contained within the report. But I just wanted to pick up on some of the discussion which happened at the last committee, where we talked about highlighting key areas of performance. So this report has come very quickly after the last one, and after the discussion, and unfortunately there wasn't time to make some of the changes which we discussed this time. I am expecting in Q2 we will be able to make some of those changes as part of the move to the dashboard that we've just looked at for the financial and activity report, in order to make it more integrated and respond to something that the committee discussed last time. But I picked out some key areas for persistently red flagged performance last time, so I just wanted quickly to run through those areas in order to ensure there was a thread from last time. Homelessness prevention was one area we looked at last time. That remains red, but we are also seeing an indicator alongside that about homelessness relief, which remains green. So it's the homelessness prevention is not fundamentally affecting the services and increasing the amount of homelessness. In children missing education, remains red at the moment. Education healthcare plans issued in time. Performance has actually improved quite a lot, and that target is now, that indicator is now running green. Non-domestic rates collection, it did improve slightly in May, but performance has dipped again in June, and that remains red. Stage 1 and Stage 2 complaints timeliness, so this refers to the number of days between when the complaint was received and when the complaint was responded to. And there's been significant improvement in the first part of this year, gone from 41% within timescales at Stage 1 and 32% within timescales at Stage 2 at the end of Q4, to 69% within timescales in Stage 1 and 68% in Stage 2. So a big improvement in those two areas. It's still red, it's still below the target, but over 3 months we've seen a significant change. I also mentioned long-term sickness absence last time. That has improved slightly in this report from Q4, but it's slightly worse than target still, and it is higher than the same point as it was at last year. So that one remains red. So there's somewhat of a mixed picture in terms of the areas that were persistently red over the previous financial year. We've seen some significant improvement in several of them. I'm going to stop there, Chair. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tom. Evolving that for the new committee is really, really important. And the amount of data, as we said before, is significant, and focusing it down the funnel to allow us to get towards what we're going to scrutinise in the future. And of course, it's not just finance in that sense, it's also about customer service, isn't it? You know, the number of complaints. And very often, if these things slip, you then find the original complainant is back on the phone 2 or 3 times, and that just puts additional pressure on. Colleagues, I think, Scott, you had some questions on this one.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
I'll fire 2 questions, if I may, in quick succession. How is the Council responding to poor performance in adult social care reviews and short-term care outcomes? And in addition to that, what are the causes of continued underperformance in homelessness prevention, and how will the new multi-agency task and finish group address these gaps?
Thank you, Scott. Who would like to tackle that one first? I see David and Claire looking at each other. David...
I was just going to see if Tom would have a go at it, but that's fine, I will. Can I take the short-term services first of all? So national monitoring of adult social care changed to something called client-level data earlier this year, which requires information to be pulled directly from our systems to government systems. And a lot of the information that we used to use within our performance indicators was not provided through those systems. In order to do that, we're now having to double the amount of work that our workers do to input that information, and there's significant lag. Thankfully, Adele, our Chief Executive, asked me exactly the same question on that indicator a couple of weeks ago. So I've had the opportunity to look into it, and the actual performance in May and June, so for May was we'd actually supported 124 people, and June 121, which actually takes performance up to 60%, which shows that it's actually a data quality issue there. Nothing to do with our performance team, it's just to do with how quickly the information gets entered within our system in order to feed that national reporting around client level data. On the, can you just give me the indicator number for the homeless one, please, Councillor Brown?
No.
Okay, that's fine. I will quickly find it. Or if there's another question whilst I just find that one. It was the number of households whose homelessness was prevented, that one. Yeah. Okay. So I think as I think the element which I mentioned at the last meeting is about trying to read the three indicators together, which is the total number of homelessness approaches, the number of households whose homelessness was prevented, and the number of households whose homelessness was relieved. And the total number of homelessness approaches, so is based on anyone can apply to the council and say, I'm homeless for a variety of reasons, but our duty is only accepted when certain conditions are met. So there's almost like an indicator missing here, which is those where our duty has been accepted. That would give you an indication then of the number of households whose homelessness was presented as a percentage of the total number where we've accepted that there is a duty there. So the sorts of things which can say a duty is not accepted is there's an outside time limit that we will consider. So someone may approach us and say, my landlord has given notice on my property and they've given me 3 months notice, but technically our duty does not kick in. I can't remember the exact number of days. I think it's about 57 days, something like that. So we can't start counting, we can't start saying that we prevented that until that period of time, if that makes sense. So there's some quirks within the data that we need to do some work on from my team's perspective. We do monitor that internally, but it's not reported through the corporate scorecard. So it's not a great answer in the sense that I can't give you a greater clarity around it. But I think Tom's what Tom said earlier was, if you were seeing that there was a detrimental impact of that performance indicator of those whose homelessness was prevented, you would see significant increases in the number of households whose homelessness was relieved as a result of that. So the two are connected. If one was performing badly, genuinely performing badly, and it wasn't a quirk of the data, it would have an impact on AFL 14, the number of households whose homelessness was relieved.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, David. I dread to say that I heard that Tom needs to have another indicator between. If I understood that properly, someone presents and says, "I'm going to be homeless in 3 months' time." Is there another indicator that would help to define that? I'm going to say indicator, whatever number it is, A and B, rather than another whole one. But that sounds to me as though that might be a good idea and a result from this evening. David?
I think it's something that Tom and I can work on. It's to do with the approaches for homelessness, and it's probably a sub-element of that, which is of the homelessness approaches that we've had, how many have we accepted a duty on? I think is probably where we would want to sort of add that nuance. We want to still highlight the number of approaches that we've got, because that is demand for us. We have to have officers that look into that activity, so that's why that one is there. But there is a bit of context which sits in have we accepted a duty.
Looking at Tom is going to respond. I think we've got the gist of it, but Tom, you're going to confirm that, yeah?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I think what we've just gone through is a really good example of what happens across all of the myriad of our services, which are in many ways quite intensely complicated, and where the way that we measure them depends on one another, and so we quite quickly get into actually if we add in that helps us understand, and we add in that, and so that's the tension which pushes the number of indicators up. It's an attempt to seek greater understanding essentially, and then we have the opposite frame of, well, actually greater understanding is probably not supported by there being an overwhelming deluge of information coming at you. So there's always going to be a balance between those two things, and I think that what's really important is that we use the indicators to help us to guide discussion and further inquiry, so that then with each step we might be using more information to help support the next conclusion.
Thank you both for the clarity on that one. I think that Steve, you had some questions on climate and sustainability KPIs.
Helps to turn this on. First, I want to say a nice, simple red, amber, green, and blue presentation information is very helpful indeed. Secondly, on climate and sustainability KPIs, these look to be relatively new, and I think you've made a comment about a lot of these stats are organic, and often there's a KPI inflation, but at the same time you're looking for more knowledge. Looking at the set of data that we have here, what kind of insights are coming out of this information, and how will those insights drive future behaviour?
Thank you, Chair. Through you. Yes. If I take that question as being in general across all of them, that's probably the easiest way of talking about it, and my colleague may wish to come in on climate sustainability individually. These indicators are used within management teams across the different areas of the council. They're used within CLT, with exec, and then within Scrutiny committee. The insights that we often start from the key performance indicator and a target, which gives us then the RAG rating tends to help us to identify if there's an issue in there. And then we go through some of the process that I was just describing, where we might say, okay, so how many households, I'll just pick on households with homelessness being prevented. So then we start thinking about, well, what other numbers might be useful to help us to characterise what's going on for those households. So we might use the data which is underlying the production of that performance indicator to identify a cohort of households whose homelessness was successfully prevented, and try to then look at other characteristics about those households, whether they came from a particular place, what the financial situation was like, for example. And then we would use that extra information to guide further inquiry about looking again at the service and how the service is being provided in an attempt to then bring the overall performance indicator back closer towards the target. So most of the time, what we use these for is we use them to help us to guide an inquiry that we're looking to do. So we use these to show us where might there be an issue, and then we use underlying data which we can look in much more detail at in order to look at what kinds of changes do we need to make to the service to resolve that issue.
Thank you for that. The reason for the question is some of the attributes that have been chosen are ones that are common in many councils. Some are or appear to be specific, and then putting on my green hat, some are potentially missing. So I'm interested in that whole process of understanding that, and also where there may be attributes that we need to look at to understand how they would fit in and contribute to what we're looking ultimately to do, which is to offer a better service to our residents. Thank you.
Through you, Chair, I'll just come back on that. I think that is absolutely right. There is a core of indicators which it's important that we understand where we are in comparison to what performance is within other councils. We touched on that very briefly if you missed the sort of the geeky conversation about the client level data set, the CLD. That's one of the impacts of that change to that statutory data collection, is that it became the definition of the way that we produced the numbers changed for all of the different councils. So they started doing it in different ways, and actually a lot of the work David's talked about the work of the regional performance groups is to try to resolve that, to have a core, to have an agreed way of calculating an indicator, so we're comparing apples with apples. And then on top of that core set, we will then be developing indicators which are particularly relevant to the goals and objectives of services in North Northamptonshire. And that means that as those services develop and those policies develop, then actually sometimes we do need to change those indicators. So we have an annual process for reviewing those. And we can do some in year by making reports through to executive, but we try to keep it keep some discipline associated with the annual process in order to avoid just changing with the wind. We need to make sure that if we are saying this is a goal, that we follow that through.
Steve, I think one of the things that is clear, and the way in which we all work together, that it's perfectly legitimate to come in with ideas for different indicators in that sense, and in the way that Tom has said. And if any of us talking within our groups or whatever come up with those ideas, then I would welcome it to come to this committee, you to come to this committee, or Ben, who you're substituting for, and present those ideas. Very, very much so. I'm sure you'll feed that back into the group environment. There's George. George, do come in.
Thank you, Chair. And just building on what Tom said, the old adage, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, I think rings true throughout all that we do as officers, as you would expect, across North Northamptonshire Council. So whilst you can see some key performance indicators and some management indicators, sort of there's a level below that again, which is that sit within officers' service plans, directorate service plans, and there's a plethora of those. And each year, as Tom was articulating, we have to attempt to determine which ones are key, which ones are management, and therefore of greatest interest based on impact, but also perhaps based on national policy, but also a local drive as well. So, for example, we know that there's an interest in reducing the amount of specific pesticides used in the way that we manage and control weeds across our environment. And so how do we demonstrate that, but also ensure that we get that balance right, particularly at the moment when we've had, particularly when you get wet and warm seasons. We've had a predominantly warm season, I think it's fair to say, but usually in the spring you get a combination of wet and warm, which accelerates that growth. And that's why you'll see, for example, in GSE 09, you can't track quarter 4 to quarter 1 because you have to look at the trajectory and the downward trend, because we know that we have to apply more pesticides at certain times of the year just because of the volume of growth that is experienced. Similarly, in terms of EV charging points, we need to ensure that we're maintaining our commitment to that alongside the sale of electric and hybrid vehicles. And so we look at the data of those sales to ensure that we are maintaining a sufficient level wherever possible of those EV charging points. So there's elements of learning, but there's also, it reflects, like I say, national and local policy with regards to that. The last thing I would just mention is, and it would be remiss of me not to mention it, is we've got the carbon management plan, which has been in place since 2022, and that's got 84 individual actions, and they've all got measures against them. So, and that's coming to place in environment scrutiny next Tuesday for those that may be interested in either tuning in or coming along.
Thank you, George, for that. The one area again, and I think it does come back to the scrutiny that we're going to do later in the year, is the health, the long-term sickness, the vacancies, you know, the way in which the transformation over the last 4 years has started to fill posts. As we start to look at the budget, that area, I'd like to, trying to think of the best way to say that, but to have some form of understanding as we go through the budget process in November, December, January, how we are filling vacancies. I know that we are budgeting as if we had a full crew on the ship, Northamptonshire, but inevitably over the years we haven't been able to recruit to some of those posts. And I think one of the things, and I look around at colleagues to see if you're in general agreement there, is that it would be very beneficial to understand how we are 4.5 years on from the relative turmoil but calmness which brought us on vesting day, with filling our vacancies and actually understanding how we gain new people and what we can actually do as councillors in terms of evangelising, come and work for Northamptonshire. So I think that is something I would like to sort of recommend as part of this aspect, if colleagues are willing to support that we would like a solid breakdown of how we're doing with filling staff posts, how we're doing in terms of sickness of colleagues, long-term sickness, and I suppose equally, where we don't have a full complement of people, how we are supporting those people who are perhaps in every department working under an amount of stress because they don't have enough people on board. So I'm trying to think, Raj, what's the quickest way of us saying, putting that as a recommendation? And any colleague got a good way of summarising what I just said as a recommendation that we put forward? Otherwise, I'll go for it. The committee... Oh, sorry, Claire. Oh, no, Guy. Someone help me out here. I think I know what I want. I'm just not articulating it.
Chair, hello. First of all, yeah, that is absolutely feasible, and we could bring something. We do actually have some more detailed information in the form of corporate health dashboards that break down things such as sickness, recruitment, retention, and some really positive trends there. But there are also some other interesting sticky areas, such as some of the harder to fill posts, and as you say, some areas of sickness. So would welcome bringing something back, and I think we've got something that we could bring back and have a really good discussion about.
Bill, Councillor Bill McHenry.
Hi. Would it also be worth sort of breaking down by department so we could possibly identify a particular department that has a lot of sick recruitment issues?
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, through you, Chair. So, yeah, our workforce data is done by service area, so we have it down to the granular level. So we do have regular departmental meetings with the HR teams in terms of talking through those workforce dashboards. So that is certainly possible. It'd just be rather a lot of information. So again, it's whether we start off with that top level and then can work our way down. But obviously the information is there to be able to support that inquiry.
So I'd like to propose that we ask for detailed workforce data, as we've discussed, to come to a future meeting. equally to help us with our budgeting process as it moves forward in November. Would someone like to move that? Councillor Scott Brown and Councillor Darren Rance. So I think we've... one further item that we've talked of, and I know David mentioned this at the last meeting, that we now have, for those of us who have been around, I look around as, for those of us, Scott and I, who have been around for the last 4 years, we now have 4-year trends. And I know, David, you mentioned that planning for the future, if we take something like, Children's Trust, we now know what it was in 21-2, 22-3, and so on. And I think for any, conventional business, if you look at your trends, that trend would be very beneficial for us to understand how our professional team of officers are using that data to predict what's going to happen in the future. And I think it would be really beneficial if some work could be done on that, on some of the key items, so that it's just very graphic. I don't know if colleagues have any views contrary or pro that, but I think it would be useful, because we very often look in year and not often the last year. Tom, you've got some answers for us there.
Yes, Chair, that's absolutely possible. I'm happy to circulate a link to a really valuable resource called LG Inform, which is a website run by the LGA, which collects together information from all of those statutory returns I talked about from councils across the whole country, and organises it into key performance indicators and allows you to do comparisons with other similar councils, whether they're similar in terms of the population and the demographics, or similar in terms of the different responsibilities they have, or regional neighbours, or all sorts of different ways of cutting it. So that will show all of that statutory return data, which includes values for Northamptonshire going back to vesting day, and will include some values for the predecessor councils and for the county council as well, because it goes a long way back, at least 10 years.
Thank you, Tom. So with Bill in mind, we probably ought to have a vote on that for those two resolutions. And the second one is to circulate all members with LG Inform. And I think it's pretty good at explaining how it works. Tom?
It is reasonably self-explanatory, but if any members find it harder to pick up, I'm very happy to help out. Just drop me a line.
No problem at all. Thank you for that. So if colleagues are happy with that conclusion on that particular item on our agenda, we now go through, I think, to the budget scrutiny timetable. Indicative budget timeline and scrutiny process. Claire, back on stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this report brings to you today the proposed budget timetable for scrutiny to help support the budget setting process for Northamptonshire. So we have a duty to ensure that we deliver a budget by the 19th of February for the General Fund, the Housing Revenue Account and the Capital Programme. So as you'll see, there's 3 areas that we will be focusing on during this process. So the General Fund does also include the dedicated schools grant and the funding for the Children's Trust. And obviously we're then going to further detail around the Housing Revenue Account and the Capital Programme. So essentially we also document in here, as I referred to earlier, we do highlight what the budget process is. So it does show you in here in section 5 what the process would be in terms of a little diagram, in terms of articulating that sort of round wheel, sort of constant process in terms of the budget forecasting review element that we undertake. So for those of you not familiar with the scale of the challenge that we have, and one of the bits that we will be looking at as part of the budget process is bringing more of that context, as you just referred to, so actually looking a bit more around the historical information in terms of where we've come from and where we are, and trying to focus on the much more risk-based approach to our budget. So it does highlight in section 5.4, so the scale of the challenge that we will be looking at over the medium-term financial plan, which is a deficit of £73 million, and obviously looking at how we can bring proposals to scrutiny of how we're looking to mitigate and bring that deficit down as much as we possibly can. What I would point out in tandem that's happening as well in the background is the fair funding review is also happening as well, so that will play a significant part into this. Nevertheless, what it does set out here is a timeline for the Children's Trust, which you may or may not know. So the Children's Trust obviously being separate to North Northamptonshire as a separate body, they have a contractual arrangement in how they undertake their budget review or contract review with ourselves as North Northampton. It's specified in here in terms of the timelines that we're having to work through. So they don't generally move. We do have to have an agreement by the 15th of January, and we have to have a final signed off draft by the 30th of November. Therefore, we have pulled this out separately in terms of the timeline for scrutiny to be engaged in that process. For the rest of the Council's budget, we start to identify the timeline that we're proposing for scrutiny to be engaged in this in section 5.13. We are trying to ensure that we bring you in line with being part and parcel of pre-scrutiny. So what this was attempting to do is to ensure that you have a fully engaged scrutiny process and actually delivers any recommendations to executive alongside the draft report in December. So our target is to ensure that we've undertaken all our scrutiny activity, can actually identify and provide a recommendation report to executive at the same time that we're delivering the draft budget. So it goes alongside it. In previous years, that has been after the draft budget and after we've done consultation to the wider public. So this is an attempt to ensure that we bring it in line and can have, as I think you heard the leader and the portfolio for holder for finance supporting the process of scrutiny being in the budget arena as it clearly should be. So what this will do, obviously, as you may not have known before, we did have numerous sessions and different phases. We are looking to collapse this now and have much more shorter sessions, but focusing on a much more risk-based. So we'll be bringing to you those sort of really high-level investor save types of proposals, as well as still seeing the detail within each directorate, but putting that in the context as the whole budget, not just looking at it section by section. So that will obviously, hopefully, we'll be working on that and we'll share with you what that may look like, or certainly with the chair, so you can ensure that you're happy with that process. But the timeline, nevertheless, will still be here for you to make sure that we can engage in that. So hopefully it's not too big of a process this year. It was quite exhaustive last year if you were involved in that process. So there will be sort of 4 opportunities to go through and for us to engage with you with any proposals that we're looking to bring forward, and hopefully give you enough time to write your report and any recommendations to executive in terms of any changes or amendments to that draft plan. So I'll pause there and happy to take any questions.
Thank you once again, Claire. Colleagues, any questions on the budget process? So Councillor Dennis McLean, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at the possibility of the multi-year settlement, are we worried that this multi-year settlement may actually bring less than what we're getting at the moment?
Short answer to that is probably yes. However, there is some significant proposals within the Fair Funding Review consultation which we engaged in and was delivered on the 15th of August. So we have responded to that. I think some of the conversations that will probably start to develop around that is, will we do better than we anticipated? It's really hard to say. Some of the indications are that we will have a good fair review of that. What does fair mean? Is it better than where we'll be? All the indications do look as though we could have a fair funding arrangement from what's being proposed. The difficulty is that to do that, the government are essentially stripping some of that funding away from other local authorities. So you really have a very big mixed bag in terms of who potentially is winning and losing in the context of what they're proposing, and there's some significant losers, particularly in the London Borough areas. So it's going to be fairly controversial. Whether they stick to what they're saying, I have some really big concerns, and the risk of what that may then do with what we get in terms of that final fair funding review. And some of the indications, in terms of what conversations are happening, some of the formulas are already pretty much set. It's going to be difficult to where they may change them. One of the biggest benefits that we will have and we will see is around the council tax harmonisation and around any population growth that they're assuming in those amended formulas. So there could be significant benefit for the likes of North Northamptonshire, but that's dependent on whether they agree with those proposed changes to the funding formulas. So it's very, very difficult to say. At the moment, we're looking at our funding envelope as we have predicted. So we're not necessarily changing any of those assumptions, and we're trying to deal with those deficits that we have already put in this paper as remaining as they are, and we still have to look at plans and proposals and some transformation activities to be able to deal with those without looking to wait for some of those funding solutions that may or may not come through.
A very complex process as ever from that point of view, and it's a bit like starting a race and no one's told you where the finish line is, isn't it, in terms of working with government. Jonathan, I think you had some questions over risk and scrutiny.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have two questions. First, in what way can a risk-based scrutiny approach assist in pinpointing service areas with the highest financial volatility or material impact? And also, how were the high focus areas such as adult social care, NCT and home to school transport selected? And are there any other areas that might warrant closer scrutiny?
Through you, Chair. So looking at the risk-based approach, this essentially is looking at terms of what's driving our makeup of our budget, and obviously the highest proportion of budget that they have. So adult social care is our biggest spender, if you like. I'm trying to use a different word. But essentially, in any Tier 1 authority, you'll find that children's social care and adult social care will take up at least 2/3 of your budget. So therefore, it's only fair to say that when we look at this on a risk-based approach, it will gravitate towards those areas. However, we will obviously give opportunity to other areas that you may feel to be of significance. We won't just focus on, they will be predominantly our main areas that we will look at, but we will also have a session to be able to think and consider other significant areas that you might think are important. But we do need to bear in mind that the significant drivers of our authority are going to be wrapped up in those activities and are the key drivers. But if we can resolve those, actually resolves our deficit. So from a financial perspective, which is what we're trying to look at here, they are very much our key drivers in terms of delivering a balanced budget. They're not our only ones, obviously, but they will be a key one. But I think those are the areas that you may wish to have a look at, which obviously we will be working with you to make sure that we can cover those off as well.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Jonathan. I've got Councillor Dennis McLean, and then I've got David Watts.
Just a quick one on your last answer there. It seems that we've got an increasing demand from what we hear in the media and stuff like that. How are we trying to deal with that?
I'll probably ask David to help on this one as well. But as part of some of the issues that we're trying to consider as part of our transformation programme, we'll be focusing around that sort of prevention question. So it comes very much in terms of how we're looking to, when we're thinking about demand. I mean, we can't say we can stop it. So the question is, how do we slow it down? How do we reduce it? How do we work with our partners in a strategic manner to obviously ensure that demand can be dealt with elsewhere and it's not just coming to the local authority. So that can take many, many different forms in terms of projects that we're considering, and essentially how we can sort of look to invest now to ensure that we can take that benefit over the 3, 5, 7, 10-year window frame. Now, prevention's always very hard to deliver, and it always takes a long time to see some results from it, but it is generally the item that will give you the biggest financial sustainability in terms of that longer term objective, aims and goals in terms of what we're trying to do. So it's not just trying to think about today. So we could just look at 26, 27 budget and just try and resolve that 1 year. Now we have a 3-year funding settlement proposal. It gives us an opportunity where we're going to have that much more certainty around some of the decisions that we can make and some of the funding streams that we're going to see hopefully coming through, that gives us a much more guaranteed funding base rather than not knowing what we're going to get from 1 year to the next. So it's really trying to, and I think it's the sort of that I said really earlier, it's how do we start to look at our services differently, and how do we start to sort of think about how we can deliver those services in a much more financially sustainable manner while still maintaining the outcomes for our residents. And that's not just limited to those service areas of high demand. It's a question right across the whole organisation. So it's really trying to have that much more transformative and transformational way of thinking. And I think it's also not limited to just doing the invest to save. We also need to think about not every road needs to lead to us either, and how do we look to how do we facilitate activity? We don't always have to be doing it ourselves. So again, it's working in partnership across different functions, and particularly like, for example, in Jane's area, where we work very closely with the voluntary sector and how we sort of enhance some of those relationships as well to sort of deliver a much wider scope of some of the services that are very close to residents, very close to members, but we can do it in a much more advocatable way rather than actually doing it ourselves. So I think there's ways that we can start to sort of think about delivering services differently. And I'll stop there, and I'm sure David will probably want to come in.
Thank you, Claire. And David, to complement that.
Thank you. I was going to give Claire some better words rather than big spenders or highest spenders. So I like to think of us as the directorate that try our hardest to manage complex demand, which costs the council a lot, but it's probably more complicated. So yeah, probably just Shirley Bassey and a bit of big spender. But so I think we already have really good examples of how we manage some of that demand. So if you look at just our performance around the nightly cost of temporary accommodation last year, we reduced our expenditure by £1.2 million in comparison to the previous year. At this moment in time, we are indicating an underspend against that budget of in the region of £600,000. So, and that's through work that we do. We took on the running of Thackley Care, Specialist Care Centre in 2023. The impact of the full year impact of that of 24-25 was a 7% reduction in permanent admissions to residential care. The average cost of a residential care placement is around about £1,000 per week. In comparison to expenditure of about £250 per week for high complexity care in that sort of older adult group. What hasn't helped is that our population continues to grow, so the demand continues to come through. So you don't necessarily see those benefits within our data, because all that you see is an increasing spend. But we can actually case track that 7% reduction in residential admissions through the people that we have supported to go through the Thackley Care Specialist Care Centre. But unfortunately, the net position is that our expenditure continues to increase. Thankfully, our demand profiles are not as big in comparison to previous years. So for those, and yourself being one of them, Councillor Hakewill, who's been in the council a while, we saw a 25% increase in our older adult population, or our expected older adult population that were in receipt of adult social care, and a 15% increase in our working age adult population a couple of years ago. This year we are back on our normal trends of across the whole of that of about 4.5–5%, which is a far more comfortable place for us to be in managing that demand moving forward. That was unprecedented. It was something that we hadn't forecasted, and it caused a significant impact on our budget in that year, of which we are still trying to recover from now, in some of the work that we're doing to try and manage that demand, because those people are still within our system.
Incredibly positive work, and I suppose it's that old idiom, isn't it? It's increasing at a decreasing level. You can't stop these things or take them backwards, but you would know, but for the work and effort that you're putting in, it would be even greater. It's a conundrum from that point of view. I'm just wondering if, Jane, we mentioned there the voluntary sector. Would you be happy just to recognising we're all learning, I'm learning too, 5 minutes on our work with the voluntary sector and how that might appear in our budgeting process later in the year? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you know.
I'm always happy to talk about the voluntary community sector, and I think as Claire's pointed out, one of the key things is the voluntary community sector is able to do a lot of the things we want to do and reach the communities in a way sometimes it's a little bit harder for us to reach as a council, and that's a very vibrant resource in North Northamptonshire. There's a lot of very, very strong organisations out there who can help us in lots of different ways. We, for example, have drawn on the voluntary community sector to do a whole range of different service delivery for us. So, for example, NHS health checks didn't come up in the discussion today, but we're looking at different ways of mobilising those checks through the voluntary community sector, because we reach parts of the population that we wouldn't ordinarily reach. And also, quite often, it's a really cost-effective way of doing it, which is fantastic. I think what we need to think about with that particular sector is where there's more opportunities to draw on that sector to deliver the sorts of services we want to deliver. One of the things the council's done, which I think has been a really good move, is we've got a contract now with the voluntary community sector called the Aspire contract. And that is really an investment from the council to say, how do we develop our local VCSE so that they are able to go for the opportunities really robustly when they arise. One of the issues we have with the VCSE is that it's really hard to do a really good tender for a contract when it comes up. It's also really difficult to know who your partners are and how you work with those most effectively. And we've been really lucky in North Northampton that a group of VCSE organisations who are very strong already have come together to support other organisations in that process. And I think that's only just started, but as that develops, we'll see lots of opportunities for organisations locally to develop and grow and be able to actually offer more services for us as a council. That's going to be really positive, but we need to get there first. Of course, we've already got lots of services that are being provided through our VCSE sector, and we want to see that growing, but it's also really important that the whole system recognises that this is not a free resource. If we want a really vibrant VCSE, we have to support it financially, and that's across the council, it's across health, it's across all different parts of our local economy. And I think that's really showing in North Northampton, particularly with the council, a really strong commitment to that, and that's only going to help us in our future budgeting to make sure we get the best value for what we want to buy as a council.
Jane, thank you very much. It's I think we are probably at a point where we can put some recommendations forward, colleagues, and from the chair, I think one recommendation. Whoa, Claire, sorry.
Sorry, Chair, not to interrupt you there, but the recommendations are set out in 3.1, and the one we really need to see is that you recommend to executive this draft timeline, because this is also on the same agenda for the 9th of September executive meeting. So we're waiting for the comments back from executive to approve this, from Scrutiny, that you agree this timeline. So that's one recommendation I really need to ensure that you do agree. Thank you, Chair.
Page 164, 3.1.
Yeah. So
I might add to this, but colleagues, 3.1 on that page, note the proposed timeline for setting the budget and that this may be subject to change in line with government announcements or other factors. Note and comment on the proposed budget setting and scrutiny arrangements for the Children's Trust. As set out in the report, see paragraphs 5.7 to 5.11. Note the overall indicative timeline for the budget setting process for the Council as set up in paragraph 5.13 and recommends to the Executive the draft timeline and areas for 26/7 scrutiny process as set out in section 6 of the report. So that goes A to D, and the Executive had better accept it, or we shall be back on to them. I did want to, and I think I can, as colleagues are keeping on to my coattails there, I would like to make an E with the agreement of the committee that we contact through Raj the Executive and ask them to think deeply about what we can do in corporate scrutiny to help them with their budgeting process. Just something like that they should pick out items which are crucial to their budgeting agenda. I'd like to make that an item E. And equally, I'm just picking up on what Jane was saying. So DEF, that the Executive identify the opportunities that they see as Executive members for engaging with and supporting the voluntary sector. So again, just that they can pick out items that are relevant. So, Raj, are you okay with, E and F? Colleagues, does that sound a good resolution from our debate we've had this evening? So I'll ask for someone to move it. Would you like to? Steve moves it and Darren seconds that. So we go A to F. Are there any other comments? I can see Claire looking quizzical, and you're allowed.
Apologies, Chair. Sorry. Just to sort of come back to the main report. So is it better that I note what you're saying in terms of those extra items? Would it be worth us looking to change section 6 to include and expand what Executive may want to consider? Because section 6 identifies those risk areas, but it's whether you want to add to those as that they may want to consider, because that's what you're asking Executive to look at. So section 6 outlines the key risk areas that we're going to look at in terms of this process, but it's whether you want to include or expand what that's considering as part of what you want to include as E and F, potentially.
So, would it work there to say in our recommendations E, in considering section 6, that the Corporate Scrutiny Board would welcome those items from Executive and also with a view to the voluntary sector? So just make it in considering section 6, just link it to that as item E. Does that make sense? Okay, we moved and seconded. All those in favour? We're all in favour. Thank you. Thank you once again, colleagues, for all the background detail. So we now go to Corporate Scrutiny Work Plan. And at last, it's not just me. Raj.
Thank you, Chair. So the next meeting of Corporate Scrutiny is scheduled to be held on the 21st of October 2025. The two main items on that agenda as it stands are the corporate plan and the residence survey outcome. As always, the Scrutiny Management Board will consider the executive forward plan as well as any other items which members of this committee may wish to raise in advance of that Scrutiny Management Board meeting. And then anything else will be added to the agenda. As I said, we have two items on that agenda currently. So I'll take any suggestions or anything we'd like to raise to the Scrutiny Management Board.
Colleagues, that's our work plan for 26th of October. Are there any comments or thoughts or additions to that, which is already down on our work plan? My only point there is, and I think it can be encompassed, having seen as we look at the corporate plan and seen the feedback, which I know Guy has got, we've done a resident survey, we've also got our corporate plan moving forward and a survey on that. Equally, I don't think it's another recommendation, but very keen with that last report to engage as much as we possibly can with our community. And it's just a straight question really to Guy. Are there members of the community that the executive and we can reach out to as we go through that corporate plan, as we go through that budgeting process? And just a quick answer, I guess. Guy?
Simple answer, yes, Chair. I can give you a more detailed answer if you wish.
You've got 5 minutes.
I could probably do it in one, but there was when we did the resident satisfaction survey, we actually asked residents if they would be willing to be contacted to find out more information. So about 25% of respondents said they would be willing to be contacted. So providing we did it in the right way, we could ask if they were interested in being further engaged in the process. We also have a residents panel as well that we could utilise. So yes, there's 2 vehicles there where we could reach out to willing recipients who would like to get engaged in the process, but have also invested some time in expressing their opinions. So absolutely.
Guy, thank you. I think we would all agree and approve that the better we explain the budget, the better we engage, the better the budget will be, or at least the better it will be respected. So with that on the work plan, do we need a resolution on work plan? Or no, we can run that through. So that really, with no other comments, finishing on the work plan, to say thank you very much to everybody in the room. I think from our sort of zero start at the election time, we're really starting to get questioning coming through and starting to understand how this organisation works. And that applies to me as to the newer councillors. So without further ado, to wish you all a safe journey home, and thank you everyone for their attendance this evening. Now, therefore,